This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health, and Society on the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. We've probably all heard the phrase, sex sells. And while that may be true, it also creates controversy. But for all the attention this subject commands, it's surprising how little we actually understand it. Sexuality is not something many people are comfortable speaking about openly. But Richelle Frabotta is not one of them. As one of the few certified sexuality educators in the country, she teaches openly and frankly from a sex-positive perspective about what have traditionally been very challenging issues. She is also at the forefront of the new Sexuality Education Studies Center here at Miami. And today, she's here to talk about the importance of sexuality education and much more. So I think this is a really interesting topic, so thanks for being here to talk more about it. How did you get into this field, and what are your credentials as a sexuality educator?
Yeah, it's one of those stories. I was raised pretty traditional Catholic, didn't really understand what was or sexuality. Honestly, I'd never heard the word uterus before. So I'm 22 years old. I have a great undergrad degree. I'm in my first job in the mental health field, and it became real apparent the mental health field is not where I needed to be. And so I called a buddy from school. She was working at Planned Parenthood, and I said, what do you got? What's going on? And she said, they have a job open for sexuality educator. You should apply. And we laughed. And then I applied, and 25 years later, this is what I do. It was an amazing idea. I didn't know people could have a job doing this. And frankly, back in the 90s, you couldn't, not in the early 90s. So as far as credentials go, I have a bachelor's in communication. I have a master's in counseling. I'm working on my PhD here in the educational leadership program right now. And you really don't need any credentials to do this work. However, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate and so grateful that the center exists is because people ought to have credentials to do this work. So I do have certifications from the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, whom we call ASECT for short. It's a pretty rigorous certification to achieve. I've had it since the mid-90s. And then they added a supervisory certification, which I've had since they created it in 2014. I'm one of 18 at last count CSES's supervisors in the United States.
And what is it you actually do as a sexuality educator? Like, how does the job work? Why would someone come to you? How do you help them? What are some of the big issues that you would typically deal with?
Sure, and that's a great question. And, again, after 25 years of being in this field, I'm still amazed. You would say, Richelle, your leg looks broken. You should go see a doctor. You would say, Richelle, you're talking about how your sink is backed up. Why don't you call a plumber? So sexuality educators get called when somebody thinks about it, and we're not usually the first thought. In our culture, everybody thinks they're a sexpert to some degree because sexuality is so culturized and ingrained in our media and advertising and in our values and everything we do, where you go to school, where you go to church, where you shop, all of that naturally feels as if we are understanding of human sexuality. And in fact, people call me kind of as a last resort or as to fix something. For example, I do work with folks with developmental disabilities, and when we started a program in 1997 here in Butler County, the people whom I worked with were referred because they had a problem behavior or a problem like, say, chronic yeast infections, and the case manager was tired of driving this individual to the gynecologist every month, and this problem had to be solved. And those are really, I get that. But honestly, my work is about being human. So when people get stuck, or when people want to explore, when people want to advance their knowledge, which they're already pretty sure they know stuff, then that's when I step in or get utilized. Most common issues, honestly, consistently since 1999, undergraduate students want me to talk about relationships, want me to talk about effective communication skills. What I want to talk about is the endocrine system. What I want to talk about is when you say you don't want to get pregnant or you don't think you'll ever have a sexually transmitted infection, where was the gap? Because now you're pregnant and now you have an STI. So I find our agendas tend to be a little different, but I'm certainly comfortable talking about things that are foremost and present on 20-year-olds, undergraduates' minds.
Is this what's pressing in the lives of college students mostly, or are these pretty common issues in general?
It's universal. Throughout my 25-year career, those are the things. Communication, how do I get what I want? Whether it's something as popular culture movie based as how do I get the sex that I want to have, or how do I just tell somebody that I don't want to do these things. So a lot of consent, refusal skills, but that's usually the secondary conversation. The primary conversation tends to be, why won't this person just do this or do that? Meanwhile, I still don't know why our very smart, overachieving 20-year-olds don't know when pregnancy can occur. So that's bothering me, and I will forever teach the endocrine cycle.
So what is the current state of sexuality education today? I grew up in a small town in Illinois and in the 80s, and I got some form of basic sex ed. I mean, we did learn about, if I can recall correctly, like when pregnancy could occur. So what is the current state of it? Has it changed? Are there things that schools don't talk about today?
Yeah, so again, that's a huge question, and you're right. If we did talk about, say, schools, it's changed drastically. In the 90s, it was just abstinence only. And then in 2000, with the George Bush presidency, the language got changed from abstinence only until marriage. So in the 90s, when I thought that we were only supposed to be talking about abstinence because that's what the top-down message was, that wasn't what students were asking me, by the way. That wasn't what teachers wanted me to teach when I was called into, I've taught counties north of Dayton all the way to Campbell, Kenton, and Boone in northern Kentucky. I was the one that got invited to go to other people's classrooms, 4th grade through 12th grade. And those weren't the lesson plans that teachers wanted me to teach. But in 2000, it became mandated, especially in the state of Ohio, I think it was 2005 to be exact, where only abstinence could be taught in schools, which again, the irony, that's not what young people and folks who worked with young people wanted young people, to know about. So it's changed a lot.
So why is it important to go beyond what's currently being done? What are some of the issues that a proper sexuality education can address? Like, why is it important?
So they're important because we're human, and sexuality is the subject matter that deals with being human. If I were to break down the word sexuality into one word, I'd call it identity. And I don't mean identity in the sexual, who you fall in love with or who you want to have sex with way, although that's a part of it. But that's the point. That's a part of a much bigger picture. Identity is, how you dress yourself for a first date is not necessarily how you will dress yourself to go to church on Sunday. So these are all ways of expressing identity. That's sexuality. Having said that, I think cultural implications, currently we're hearing a lot about #MeToo. So consent has really forefronted itself. The idea of body ownership has forefronted itself. Those seem to be some pretty hot topics. I think teaching about sexuality, and I support a comprehensive approach, so not just one course when you're in 8th grade or a semester when you're graduating high school. I'm a K through 12. And I think what we'll find if that were to be instituted, I would say, very specifically, I would say less sexual violence. I believe sexual violence will decrease. And I think the challenges that come with saying yes to penis-vagina intercourse that people don't want to deal with at that moment, such as unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, such as chlamydia, HIV, herpes, etc., I think those things will decrease as well.
All these benefits, like especially as you list them out, they all seem so obvious, like common sense. So what is the barriers? Why do they still exist? Historically, many ideas have led to a general silencing or even outright repression around sexuality. But why is that? Why has it always been such a thing? It always has seemed to be such a struggle to get to a place where it seems like so many positive things could happen.
Yeah, I know, right? My goal was to do myself out of a job, right? Why should my work exist? We have parents. We have micro communities that we live in, such as religious culture, such as neighborhood culture, such as school culture. We've got lots of really caring grown-up people who want young people to get information and succeed, right? It's a no-brainer. So to be candid, I don't really get it. And I have to really push myself to remember the shame and the guilt, because that's going to be my answer. You know, we've got huge conversations happening. In the field of sexuality, we could talk economics. There's a capitalistic, what is the right frame of the word? There is a capitalist economy thrives when we sell products for people to use, such as feminine hygiene care. To be candid, most of the stuff on the market that says you're supposed to smell better down there, women, is completely unnecessary. Yet it's marketed and sold. So there has to be a problem with the down there in order for you to want to buy the product. So that's just an example of what I mean by capitalism. Why do we need 6,000 brands of condoms? Okay, I get it, because we live in a country that says we can do that. Great. But why would really anybody want to buy an animal skin or natural skin condom? And if they do, is it because they're educated and know the difference between that type of condom and, say, a latex condom versus a silicone-based condom, right? So I think we need my job because nobody's teaching discernment around products and product use. And then, you know, we have to talk about our cultural values and norms, which I think are framed oftentimes for folks in religious context. And not that it has to be, so shout out to non-religious folks. Having said that, we all have a moral code, and most of ours, I think, in the United States was informed by at least a Christian, if not a Jewish, and of course other perspective. So what are those particular moral codes saying around things like sex and sexuality? So we've got economics, plus we've got moral code, and then we've got this idea of how do we develop fully into who we are. And most of us have been raised to not want to disappoint people in our lives. So, because think about it. I mean, James, what's the first question when a baby is born? Most people ask, is it a boy or girl? And then we have folks in our culture, in our communities all over the place who don't necessarily identify as a boy or as a girl. Whether we're talking about folks who are intersexed, which is a physiological concern, or we talk about folks who are trans-identified, which is also a physiological concern, but all of these things have cultural implications. And so I think we're looking at, again, you know, economics, moral code, and this idea of individual development and identity. And I think there's some real value that some folks, not me, find in keeping people buying those products or feeling crappy about themselves or meeting other people's or other organizations' needs as opposed to developing fully individually on their own in the rightful, unique way that they are. Yeah, shame and guilt, man. Judgment, shame, guilt.
Yeah, it's so curious. There's always seemed to be this disconnect, you know, between on one side what is not only such a natural behavior, it's literally an essential biological function that has led to the life of everyone ever. But on the other side, it's always something that is portrayed as negative or something to be avoided or again repressed. But it does make more sense in the context that you present of power, oppression, expectation that can lead to all this, you know, cultural baggage.
Exactly. When ideally, and I'm guessing we believe this, I know most people believe it, it should be a joyous act of connection. Now how and what definition is act of connection, what is joyous, I don't know. But that's again the beauty of my job. I'm not your mom, I'm your teacher. And I think teachers should support students where they are in healthy choices without me saying what your healthy choice ought to be. Now, there are clearly some things I cannot support, and my students know those right away when I'm in a classroom. There are 3 things. We're just not going to do that. I mean, we can talk about it, of course, but you cannot have sex with people who don't consent. That's not okay. And so there are some hard and fast rules, but most of the work that I do is really gray. Unfortunately, there are folks who believe, and this is that conversation again about co-opting the sexuality education message with moral dictates, and there are folks who think that the world should only work one way. That's not true.
I've heard you say in your classes that you often teach college-level students. You teach them this material at a 6th grade level, and I thought that was really surprising. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, and what I mean when I say that, I'm teaching a 6th grade curriculum in a 300 level course is because we're doing the basics. There's a group of folks I really respect. I think it's 3 or 4 different national nonprofit bodies came together and created what we call the standards, the National Sex Ed Standards. And you can access this. It's at FOSE, Future of Sex Ed, online, and you can download the standards. They also talked about teacher preparation standards, which I also value. So this group of people actually put in writing in a format that all of us can access a philosophy that I've been supporting and espousing before the standards existed, and that is you need to be informed in order to make healthy choices. If we continue, and I'm referring to the abstinence-only until marriage programming stuff, if we continue to non-inform, or if we continue to have educators who are great teachers but also uninformed in this particular interdisciplinary information, or don't choose to teach medically accurate, or don't choose to pull their personal values out of their curriculum as much as possible, then we're still going to have me teaching the same course since 1999. Birth Control 101, Endocrine System 101, STIs 101. Showing a picture of genitals that have been exhibiting symptoms of particular STIs is not education. Maybe for pre-med students, but that is not going to help a young person make informed decisions about what to do with their bodies down there. It's not a deterrent, it's just ridiculous.
It also seems like it's part of another disconnect, right? Conversations about sex can be awkward, and as we've all already established, often portrayed as negative or oppressed in some way, but yet, ironically, it's also absolutely everywhere. It's used to sell cars and alcohol and products of all kinds. It's in magazines and emphasized in almost every aspect of the media. It's earlier used the word culturized, so it seems like a mixed message, to say the least. So in light of all that omnipresence, but yet also ironic avoidance, does that raise the risk of misinformation? You know, almost anyone, young people especially, can just go online and get bombarded with unrealistic sexual scenarios or, you know, unrealistic body images. So are they actually getting misinformation, or maybe information from not the best sources, like from movies or from the internet?
Or not at all. First, I would argue that some students don't have access to information for lots of reasons. Second, I would argue, I think what you're positing, that yeah, there are students who have access to information and maybe they're getting misinformed through that. I would agree. And so I want to teach how do you become an informed consumer of information? To kind of switch wheels but make the same point, pornography, which I use the term adult erotica, and I use it with intention. Adult erotica, first of all, not for kids, right? Does that mean kids aren't seeing it? No, of course kids are seeing it. You can lock down anything, and I'm pretty sure a kid's going to be able to figure out how to get to it if they're determined enough to, which, you know, then I'm going to want to support them in trying to figure out what they need to figure out. Having said that, I would love to teach that adult erotica is not reality. Now, sitting here in this office as grown people, and by grown people I'm talking about brain development. So when I'm dealing with a 23-year-old, when I'm working with an 18-year-old, when a 13-year-old presents as wanting information, they may all want the same information. How it gets delivered and their brain's ability to discern the quality and the credibility and then what the heck to do with that information is very different. And these are where my ed psych folks come in as far as my discipline is concerned. It's not always about development. We got to throw in a lot of culture there too. However, yeah, just because somebody can access it doesn't mean they know what or how to do with it. And most sources that are offering information, I'm not impressed with.
So pornography does, or adult erotica, as you say, especially concerning the ease of access now, it does seem accessible very much more so now than ever before, which is a concern for parents and probably a lot of people. Does that increase the harm that may result for people who may not as easily figure out that disconnect between what is fantasy and what is reality? Or
I also think most humans do figure it out, but that doesn't mean that when that individual turns 47 and is in their second relationship because the first one went down in flames, that not processing or asking or getting information wouldn't have perhaps influenced that first relationship differently, right? You know, there are some incredible things coming out of watching adult erotica, and this whole Me Too movement around consent. You know, my students laugh, and that's important because it is funny, but I remind them that just because somebody's delivering your pizza doesn't mean they want to have sex with you 10 minutes later. And, you know, if you don't get to unpack it, sure, I mean, I don't think most people are scarred or traumatized, but there's an element to recognizing and discussing here that, again, in an academic environment, that's the stuff we embrace, right? And these are the things we talk about in my classroom.
I did read one of your academic papers where you quote the sexual educator and expert and psychotherapist Ian Kerner, who says he does not see pornography as the main cause of objectification or sexual violence. Rather, he says that the language around sex hasn't really changed in the last 200 years, that we continue to pathologize sex. Is that really the larger problem that our culture has with sex, do you think?
Yeah, in my informed opinion, it is. It's exactly. I mean, you've already made the point. Sex exists. I mean, even whether we go biblical or we go, evolutionary biology, we can talk in both schools of thought. Human sexuality exists, right? To what end, to what purpose is the moral debatable, or is the economic approach, right? Having said that, none of that has changed. How it's packaged and received or shamed or stuck under the bed or in the closet is what we're dealing with. And if we don't, there are plenty of examples, and, it's so easy to do this research, but, our friends over in the Netherlands, in countries who are similar in construct to the United States, in the way that folks who do this type of research say, human sexuality is a norm, is a natural thing. For young people to want to have sex and then to make decisions to do sex is not weird. It's normal. So yeah, we need to unpack that. We need to depathologize, which is going to be really hard to do in our culture. And that's what comprehensive sex ed does. If we don't start expanding or allowing folks to expand the conversation, then, it's just going to continue. And we see it in so many horrific ways that people are very quick to say are values-based. Do you believe in choice? Do you believe in a woman's body, that a woman has a right to do with what she wants with her body? These are all conversations that continue to inform how sex, and in particular sexuality, I mean, it's sex definitely, but sexuality is undervalued as a cultural discourse unless it's politicized or used for capital gains. I'm comfortable saying that.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Richelle Frabotta, certified sexuality educator and Miami University instructor. In the next episode, you can join us for part 2 of this conversation on human sexuality, where we'll talk about whether acceptance around sexuality is getting better or worse, and we'll talk more about the work and the mission of the new Sexuality Education Studies Center and how people can get involved. Until then, you can download many more free episodes of our podcast right now on SoundCloud and on iTunes.